It's July 26, Ukraine Media Center current form starts its operation. My name is Svetlana Chiparenko. About a year ago, on the night of 28-29 June, Russian army, Russian occupiers committed a terrible crime. They inflicted a strike on Olenivka detention site where our prisoners of war were illegally detained. About 50 Azov servicemen died that night, and about 70 more were heavily wounded. Media Initiative for Human Rights reconstructed the events of that mass killing of our Azov servicemen, and today they will tell us in detail how it was happening and what have we found out upon the results of this reconstruction. I want to introduce our guest, Tetiana Katrychenko, author of the Investigation Media Initiative of Human Rights, Andriy Yakovlev, lawyer and expert with the Media Initiative for Human Rights, Maria Klymyk, author of the investigation, a journalist at Media Initiative for Human Rights, Anna Lobova, wife of a prisoner of war wounded in Olenivka, and Arina Khavalskych, wife of a prisoner of war killed in Olenivka. Dear guests, first of all, I would like to ask you, how was the reconstruction going on? What were the resources engaged and what were the techniques you were using? Good afternoon, dear colleagues, dear journalists, everybody who attends this meeting today, dear guests. We want to thank Media Center for this opportunity. Let's start with the priority of such investigation that we may talk about. About a year ago, the whole world was badly impressed by this event when we found out that in colony number 120, which is located in the occupied territory, there was an explosion. And according to the members of the families of the servicemen who were detained in that colony, they have not believed it. They were thinking it was a fake spread by Russian media. But eventually it turned out to be true. Why I'm saying this? Because this episode clearly illustrates that the detonation, the strike, it was so wild, so incomprehensible, and so important for the investigation by both Ukrainian and foreign law enforcement agencies. For a long time, we, as a Media Initiative for Human Rights, which starting from year 2016 investigates the matter of detention sites in temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, and we continue studying the situation in temporarily occupied territories and in Russia Federation. And with the beginning of the full-scale invasion, we started paying our attention to the Olenivka detention site, because we were realizing a lot of prisoners of war, the Ukrainian servicemen, along with the civilians who were detained mostly during the screening measures, were forwarded to the detention site. We were investigating what's going on there. We were collecting evidences, and in autumn last year we prepared the material where we were trying to understand what type of detention site it is, who is the director, how it is outfitted, where it's located, and where some specific barracks are located in the detention site. And that explosion, the killing of the prisoners of war on the night of 28-29 June, was one of the episodes of our previous investigation. And in this investigation, we decided to focus on the events of that night, to try to understand the sequence of events unfolding back then. We were keeping track of the situation, but in in our conscious and in the minds of many others, I think there was a story on the background that this crime, it should be investigated with the top priority. All the bodies of those killed should be returned, all those wounded should be returned, and in fact we may consider not only those 70 servicemen and civilians wounded who were then transported to Donetsk, but also those who were staying in disciplinary confinement cell in Olenivka. We thought that all of the prisoners of war who were heavily injured, they would be returned. And when we started to find out what is the situation as of now, we realized that since the last year, at least in the information space and according to the data that we were able to obtain, the situation has not changed significantly. Basically, by we I mean the journalists, the society, the families, former prisoners of war were aware of the same details, and we all had access to the same information sources. I would like to remind you in brief what we know for the time being about what had happened in Olenivka back then. We may say that on the 27th of June 2022, a barrack in the industrial zone, which was not previously used for detention of the civilian and military prisoners, 198 Azov servicemen were transferred. 5 of them were taken later to Donetsk, so we had 193 left. On the night of 29th of June, there was an explosion, or to be precise, a series of explosions. We cannot say for sure how many explosions there were and what weapon was used. But we've seen on the pictures the bodies of those killed. We've seen the burned bodies. We know about a number of above 50 servicemen killed. We know about a figure of more than 70 injured, and we also know that the preliminary opinion of the Ukrainian law enforcement agencies was that the thermobaric weapon was used, because on the pictures that we've all seen there were heavily burned bodies, so it meant that they were burning at very high temperatures. And we also know that the world condemned this shelling, this terroristic act in Olenivka, as it was called later. We know that the Office of Prosecutor General, in coordination with the Security Service of Ukraine, investigates the case of this episode according to the Article 448. And we also know that there was a United Nations mission created, which eventually have not a special monitoring mission that eventually have not gained access to Olenivka detention site. However, they had an intention to gain such access. We cannot say to what extent that mission was proactive in their position, because during the termination of the mission, it was stated that the parties were not able to guarantee the security during the access to Olenivka detention site. We can also state that the families of the servicemen who were in that barrack, in those barracks, the families were scattered all across Ukraine. They did not know each other, and until January 2023, they were not so united. They did not communicate between each other. They did not even know who was investigating that crime. I mean, the Ukrainian law enforcement agencies, whom they should ask for any details, whether there are all the complete details in the DNA database, for example. So now, after 1 year, we understand that investigation is underway. Almost all of the bodies were handed over to Ukraine by Russian party. Now the majority of the servicemen who were staying in those barracks are currently buried. But there are still a lot of questions remaining, and the first one is why and who decided to gather the servicemen of Azov in those barracks, and why it was done, what it was done for. Then who and how decided to commit the killing in the territory of the detention site, and who should be brought to liability for that crime. This is the question that has no answer for the time being. We understand that investigation of this crime is quite a difficult case for Ukrainian law enforcement agencies, because Ukrainian law enforcement agencies, in all the responses to our inquiries, they reference the fact that they have no access to the occupied territory, to the site of crime, and they cannot identify the facts. However, the only thing that can be done is questioning the evidences, and upon those evidences, the witnesses, and upon the evidences of the witnesses, we can draw the general picture, the sequence of events, and the consequences. So we decided with our team to initiate an alternative investigation, to do the questioning, and within this short period, using those tools that we are available to us, we were not able to identify all of the perpetrators, and we cannot say that our investigation is final, or we cannot claim the final nature of our investigation, but we at least try to communicate with the servicemen who were exchanged, who were also in those barracks, those who were injured, those who were at the crime site on the same date, and we attempted to recreate the events so that maybe even the society understands better what happened in the territory of Olenivka detention site at about 23:45 on 28th of June. Thank you, Ms. Tetiana. The information is really being picked by crumbles, because really there is no access to that territory, and we really appreciate the great job you have done. Miss Maria, can you please tell us what was the picture you've seen after the reconstruction? What have you found out? What was going on inside the barracks and outside the barracks? Can we please put the presentation on the screen? Look, this is the approximate plan of the barracks. We were trying to recreate it upon the words of the guys who got back from imprisonment, and we recreated the way it was happening from 27th until the 29th of June. So it all started 1 week before that event. There were gossips emerging in the colony about some lists. People were about to be transported somewhere, and those lists were exactly those 189 Azov servicemen who were transferred to the industrial zone. Before that, no one knew about the existence of that industrial zone. However, 1 week before that event, there were repaired works started in that territory, and the workers from the brigades, they were preparing the site quickly so that Azov servicemen are transferred there subsequently. The Azov servicemen, until the very last moment, did not know how they were picked up, based upon which principle, how that list was put together. So they were brought to that industrial zone, and they were not understanding why that specific place until the very last moment, because it was very dense in their barracks. However, they already had their life kind of arranged there, and that part is where the bunks were located very densely against each other, and there was no even free space to walk between them, so it's difficult to say about any improvement of living conditions. This is a kind of a hall, a corridor where the Azov servicemen established a kitchen, and there was somebody on duty watching the order there, or who got in touch with the guard, for example, so the prisoners can get something from the guards, because they only had the bunks without mattresses or pillows there. So this is what the part of the kitchen was looking like. You see those windows there looking inside the barracks. So in the eve of the explosion on the 28th, in the night, there was a formation. They were all put in line, checked against the list, and one by one guided inside the barracks. They were told it's prohibited to walk outside, everybody should be staying inside the barracks, and if anybody wants to leave for the bathroom, they should go one by one. Before that, they could walk out before the taps, even sleep outside, but in this part of the barracks they were prohibited to even spend the night outside, because they were asking to stay outside. It was too hot. Those windows, they were densely closed, and because of the density of the people in the barracks, it was very hot inside, but they were prohibited to do anything. Also, before that, since they are military, they should be aware of their whereabouts, about the territory. They walked all across the territory, but haven't found anything suspicious there. Here, near the entrance, they had a kind of an engineer facility, 2 small rooms. They had meetings there, and they were solving some disciplinary problems, and this evening they were deciding whether the taps would be on 22 or 23, so they decided to make taps at 22:30, and the head of the barrack walked all across the territory, checked all of the guys, he talked to the person on duty, and about 23:15 he went to sleep, and all of the barracks, they were almost all asleep. The first explosion that was heard by the people occurred somewhere outside the colony. Not everybody had heard it. Someone has woken up because they got used to the explosions. There were explosions all around the territory, because the Russians were putting Grad MLRS around the colony. So those who had woken up, they've seen that the windows are all right, everything seemed fine, and they went back to sleep. But about 23:45, 12 o'clock, there was an explosion inside the barracks near the entrance door. You can see in this part. And according to what the guys were saying, it was a metal door, very heavy. It was almost impossible to move them, and the first projectile incoming was in that part of the building. You see, in that part, this is the main part which was affected by the shock wave, and all of the people who were staying in that part, they died at once, because in some pictures we may see that the people, their bodies, whether they were lying on the bunks or sitting, this is how they were killed. And then the fire started and their bodies caught fire. Also, a serviceman who was visiting this barrack on the 29th, who was trying to who came to that barracks to recognize the bodies, he said that where the people were staying in that engineering facility, those people survived, and that part people were injured with shrapnel. of different degree of heaviness. Specifically, those were heavily injured who were sleeping in the lower bunks. Those who were sleeping in the upper bunks, they got less injured by the shrapnel. A part of the roof has fallen. We may see it, a part of the roof has fallen, and the people who were sleeping in that part, they just woke up to the roof falling on over them. It was very hot, and this is why they had woken up. We can see that that part was closer to the entrance. All the bunks were pressed by the shockwave into a pile of metal detritus. So people who were staying back there, they had to climb over all of those bunks to get to the exit. On their way, they were seeing the people who were injured but were not able to get from under the debris. And even being injured, they were taking those who could not make it out themselves. They were taking them with them outside. And then the people, you see, from those further premises, they were walking outside through that door. We cannot see the door on this picture, but the witnesses, they were saying that there was a part of the door lying on the floor, so they were climbing on top of those bunks, that gate and everything. And after the first projectile incoming that was incoming into that door, we can suppose there was another explosion in the corner. You see, this is where the barracks connects to the next building, and the witness who was taking apart the debris, clearing the debris, he was saying that the part of the roof has fallen and part of the wall, it fell inside the next building. There was a huge piece of the wall fallen out, but in pictures and videos publicized by Russians, there is no that part of the building. They were trying to conceal that there was another explosion hitting this specific corner. Also, according to the information from the witnesses, since the guys were not understanding what was going on, they were disoriented, they had pain shock. Someone could not orient where to move. Some of them started moving to the opposite side, to that corner of the barracks, and maybe somebody got suffocated with smoke there because they were running to the wrong side and couldn't make it out themselves. The fire erupted very quickly. The bodies caught fire right away, and the people could not get outside the building by themselves. Also, since before that they were walking across the territory, they have found some weak links. For example, in the fence, they were realizing that if there will be a command to get out of Olenivka, this is where they would be able to find an exit, and this is what saved them, because when they were running out through that front door, in one part they just broke a part of the fence, and then they ran quite a long distance. This is where the exit was, and they had run all the way to the fence. The wall was very hot. You cannot lean against the wall. And when they've heard those terrible screams, then when they've seen that everything is on fire, they realize that they have to pull those who cannot make it out of the building themselves. They have to pull them out outside. The fire was very dense. They were trying to pull out the bodies of their brothers in arms, so the bodies can be returned to the families. At least they were trying to pull out at least somebody, even regardless that they were heavily injured by shrapnel themselves, but on adrenaline they were still trying to pull the bodies of those unconscious or those who were unfortunately already dead. And then when there was nothing else they can do, inside the barracks, or they were not able to pull more bodies outside. This is where yet another hole in the fence was, through which they were getting out. So this is where they broke a hole in the fence, and they've come a pretty long way from the entrance to that hole in the fence until the exit from the colony. And there was a guard who opened fire on them. They were crying for help because the guards were afraid that the guys would run further, and no single representative of the guard or administration of the colony approached the barracks since the moment of explosion, until the very moment the guys broke to the administrative buildings. No single representative of administration helped them in putting out the fire or pulling out the bodies of the injured and dead, or to provide any medical help. So when they got closer to the alley, they started asking for help, but the administration of the colony were standing behind the gate, and they were taking no actions to help them. So the guys were tearing their clothing. They were trying to make bandages out of that torn clothing. They were trying to hand over the bodies of those heavily injured outside the territory. They've seen the ambulance cars coming behind the fence, but the ambulances were not let in. And the medics were prohibited to enter the territory of the colony. However, the imprisoned medics came up there. They gathered all the medical means. In reality, there was very little such things, but they were waiting for the guards to come pick them up to provide medical aid to those injured. So they were waiting for about 2 hours, and when they came to that alley, a medic who was questioned by us, he described it as a terrible picture that he said he would not, he never thought he would have seen after Azovstal or Ilyicha industrial facility. There were people with different kinds of injuries, with their stomachs injured, heads injured, and they were coming to that alley to ask for help by themselves. And medics only had a couple of tourniquets, a little bit of painkillers, and as the guys were saying, only then some of the guards started throwing pieces of clothing, some rags, so they could make bandages for their wounds. But as the medics said, since the administration of the colony was not in a hurry to provide any medical aid, 5 of the guys died right in that alley due to the loss of blood or due to internal wounds that could not be healed without significant medical aid. And since the moment of explosion until the very moment of evacuation of the guys, 6 hours had passed, and the medics who were injured, not critically injured, but still they were trying to rescue their brothers in arms, and the heavily injured were started to get transported by the military trucks, not even by the ambulance cars. They were put on the stretchers on top of each other. They were heavily injured, but no one was carrying. And on the way to the hospital, about 2 or 3 more people have died since they were improperly transported. And as one of the servicemen who was transported in the second KAMAZ truck, that truck was just going on a high speed without stopping in front of the potholes, so the guys were additionally injured by the way they were transported. And on the very next day, on the 29th of June, one of the Azov servicemen who was not in that barrack, he was forced to recognize the bodies of his brothers in arms. He was given a highlighter and he was told, like, tell us who's where. And the bodies that were carried out of the barracks, they were so heavily burned that they could only be recognized using the DNA examination. He also confirms the words of the guys who were in the barracks, that there were two explosions specifically at those spots, with very powerful explosions, because it almost destroyed a wall and a gate. He says it was something very powerful, and he also mentions that being there on spot, he'd seen the Russians in his presence to bring a bag with the debris and scatter them around the site to represent it as the detritus of HIMARS. So he's sure that those debris are fake debris, because they were brought at the site only later, after the explosion. Also, he was mentioning that the guard basically did not help the guys in no way. Only on the very next day it was all done to demonstrate to the journalists what a terrible crime was committed by the Ukrainians. However, he states that there are many things in the actions of the Russians that may be disputed. Their version is just made up to accuse Ukraine of the crime that the Russians committed by themselves. Miss Maria, thank you very much for detailed explanation of the terrible thing committed by the Russians against our Azov servicemen. It's symbolic that the air raid alert is now on, and the Russians launch their missiles against us. If everybody needs, there is the shelter in the premises of this facility of Ukrinform, but we see that the situation for Kiev is currently calm. So let's continue. Mr. Andriy, I would like to ask you how the international organizations were helping and are helping in investigating what had really happened, who is guilty of that crime. Well, on top of their deep concern and on top of the fact that the United Nations recognized yesterday that it was not a Ukrainian missile that hit Olenivka detention site, and what is the place of this investigation in further big investigation in bringing to liability of those guilty of committing that crime in Olenivka? Let me try to do it real quick so that the girls have an opportunity to tell us more. So first, talking about international organizations, we know that there was a United Nations mission initiated. However, the mission was terminated. It's unclear to me what were the reasons for termination. Maybe Russia refused. We see on the pictures there were some representatives of international organizations present there, or their security was not guaranteed. If we say that the United Nations mission said that the security was not guaranteed, then we have a question: guaranteed by whom? Whether it was Russia or Ukraine, or if the security is not guaranteed, maybe there should be some steps taken, and not other than termination of the mission, because since there are attacks on the missions of humanitarian organizations, there is a criminal liability. It's a war crime. So basically the task of international organizations is to investigate the crimes when the parties cannot investigate them. So importance of this situation is such that it doesn't sound convincing. I mean, the reasons that the security cannot be guaranteed, at least we should mention who cannot guarantee the security, and we should take steps to guarantee it. Talking about the legal side of this case, we can talk about two things. First, the explosions and everything that was going on after that. So everything that is related to the explosions and their consequences and investigation of the case. When we talk about the explosions, we have to take into account the Geneva Convention, specifically Geneva Convention 3, that guarantees the behavior with regard to the prisoners of war. They contemplate the guarantees. The imprisoning party should guarantee the security not against improper behavior but also against death. We see that that guarantee was not fulfilled and the deaths happened. And the Article 13 says that failure to comply with those obligations is a violation of Geneva Convention, and the international humanitarian law is formulated so that the serious violations are the war crimes. This is something envisaged by the additional protocol, specifically Article 86. So we may state that the Russia admitted the death, they are guilty of death, and then they continue to fail their obligations. And Ms. Tetiana has said that the community does not have proper details to evaluate to what extent the fulfillment of that obligation was on our part, but we understand we have limited capabilities, we have no access to the territory, we cannot question those who may be involved or might be involved in the incident. However, from the point of view of Russia, they do not provide access, they do not fulfill investigation, they do not share information, and we may say that it's yet another violation which constitutes a serious violation, because we know for sure that they were not only dead, but there was an extensive number of people injured, which means that people could be provided medical aid, and failure to provide medical aid only increased the number of those killed. And I mentioned Article 13, which says that the prisoners of war should be kept safe, their lives should be preserved, and even given the doubt who's guilty, who's not guilty, we know for sure that the rights of the prisoners of war were so badly violated that those who were injured, they died, so no one was rescuing them. And we may say that in this case we need to reestablish the international missions, and we should force the Russian party to provide access for the international investigators. We know that this colony is not functioning for the time being, and respectively we may state that since, according to the information that we have, the guys were gathered according to some list, after that list was decomposed, so they were gathered for some event there, or otherwise there should be some court process or something like that. I think I'm wrapping up here, and I will pass the microphone to more speakers. Joining us here are the members of the families of those who were there. Wife of a prisoner of war wounded in Olenivka, Anna Loboda, and Arina Khovanskih, wife of a prisoner of war killed in Olenivka. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lobova Anna. I'm a wife of a prisoner of war wounded in Olenivka, Oleg Lobov. There is a lot of information. I don't even know where to start. But if I bring myself back to that day, it was about 9 o'clock in the morning. In the mass media, there were news that there was a shelling of Olenivka detention site. Every family, obviously, of those servicemen who were in Olenivka detention site got concerned, because we understand there are members of our families there. And at the lunchtime, we've seen the first videos and pictures that made us realize that something had happened there. So there were the first people liberated who were returned to Ukraine in the end of July, and one of those was a friend of my husband. He checked through all of the pictures and videos, and he said no prisoners were kept there. It's a type of an industrial zone. But then I tell him, like, look at those pictures, people died there. And on the night from 29th to 30th of June, there are the lists of killed and wounded emerged. I woke up and I've seen the name of my husband on that list. I never knew there was a list of the injured, so I've seen the name of my husband on the list of those killed. And the first thing that came up to my mind that it's no accident, because there were no details about my husband on the internet. And then there was information about two people who died on the way to the hospital, and they say that they are those whose names are repeated. It means they may be injured. And I asked the girls, so whose names are repeated? And they told me there is a list of those injured. So I started checking that list, and I thought that my husband was among those who died on the way to the hospital. And the time has stopped for me. I didn't know what to do, and every day I was looking through the videos from the hospital. I was looking for a familiar face, but I was failing to find him. I've seen other families quarreling. Everybody wanted to find their family members there. And finally, on the 17th of August, on the channel of a blogger whose channel is prohibited in our country, but we were looking through those channels because we were looking for our close ones. I didn't want to see those videos, because every time I hear those comments, I see the photos in front of myself, and I never knew if I find my husband there. And after minute 5, I've seen my husband in the hospital. I paused the video and I sent the screenshot to all of my family members. I don't know, I didn't want to share this information with my friends back then. I wanted just some time for myself. And I was realizing it was him. He got thinner, but his mimics, his voice, I've recognized him right away. I didn't see the video until the very end. I was only looking at that screenshot, and my brother tells me, do you hear the sounds in the background? And I'm saying no. And there were explosions in the background. The guys were speaking about their injuries, how they were getting out of that detention site. And for the first time since the 2nd of March, I've heard the voice of my husband. And obviously I was rejoiced, and then there was only silence and expectation that there were hopes that there were mistakes on the list, and there were hopes that there are more of our fighters alive. So I was waiting on and on until the exchange on the 29th of September, and I got this hope. Our guys are coming back, but time has passed, and it's 5th of January, and they tell us the mission is terminated. And I don't know why. The bodies have come on the 5th of October, and then 2 more bodies were returned earlier that were not mentioned as those from Olenivka. But on the 5th of January, I still had not known it. I was only familiar with one of the families of those prisoners of war, but I submitted a letter to the Office of the Commissioner for Human Rights to make a meeting of those whose family members were injured in Olenivka detention site. They referenced the dance schedule of the commissioner, and they said they were not able to set up a meeting. I called yet another phone number from the letter, and I say it's been half a year and no one wants to talk to us. And then Alexander Kononenko is meeting us online, and we have the first meeting. I had 2 weeks to find at least 10 more families who are somehow related to Olenivka, and with that girl I know, Maria, we start looking for more families. It becomes more and more of us. On the 26th of January there is the first meeting where we understand that there is no investigation around Olenivka. We only blame the international organizations, and I'm having a question. So who's responsible for this case in our country? whom should we ask about any details? So our group is getting bigger. We understand that we should get united, the families of those killed and wounded. So we continue setting up meetings. We ask for initiating of case of Olenivka, where the names at least would be recreated of those who were transferred to those barracks, and everybody keeps saying it's unreal, we cannot find out the names. And I have a strange feeling, on the 21st of September at least 19 people from those barracks were liberated. They know somebody, plus there's more and more of those exchanged and liberated. The work has started. I don't know whether there is a specific case in coordination headquarters. The speakers give different answers. Unfortunately, I was not able to meet Mr. Azov. We communicate more with Oleg Slobodyanik, who knows us as our family, as his own family, I'm sorry. He knows all of our questions. We are helped by Yulia Primak, who got engaged in this process, but you realize it's been a year, and now we try to report, and we have these figures 50 plus, 70 plus. We don't even know the exact number of the people who were killed, who were injured, who were liberated, where they are. So the process is very complicated. And when we say terroristic act in Ukraine, it's not recognized as a terroristic act. We should address the international organizations as soon as the crime is requalified as the terroristic act. Our community was able to visit the headquarters of the United Nations in Geneva, but we keep doing this work by ourselves. We have no access to the top-level government officials, but we continue doing what we can. We are inspired by the families of those who died. Svetlana Solonska, we started this community of Olenivka families with her. It happened so that the husband of Svetlana was on the list of injured, but he didn't make it to the hospital, unfortunately. Meanwhile, my husband was on the list of dead, but turned out to be injured. Svetlana represents our interest in Turkey now, and she's fighting for liberation of all of the Ukrainian prisoners of war. So I'm done here. Let me pass the mic to Arina. Good afternoon. My name is Arina Khovansky. I'm a wife of Azov serviceman who died 1 year ago on the night 28-29 of June. My husband has died right on site, being heavily injured. As Anya said, we were visiting Geneva, the session 130 of the United Nations. We were meeting the Secretariat of the United Nations and the Red Cross. What we found out from the United Nations was that the mission was terminated because there is no access to the tragedy site, and this was the only excuse of theirs, I can say, because we were insisting that this Olenivka tragedy is not only for destroyed walls. Those are the prisoners, the injured ones who still remain there as witnesses. They are still under threat, they're still in danger, and those are the bodies of our killed servicemen that were returned to Ukraine in October. They can be examined too. Upon our question whether it's possible to establish an investigation mission, they said that yes, it's technically possible, but the chance is very weak. In the Red Cross, they were saying that they are not responsible for the lives of the prisoners of war which walked out of Azovstal facilities. The only thing that they said, that they were only responsible during their exit and listing of the names of those who got out of Azovstal, and that's probably it. So we continue, our community continues to emphasize that we need an international investigation. We need to identify the perpetrators, those who are involved in this terrible crime, and we need to make sure those people are punished. For Russia, it's a terrible mass killing, and Russia will not get away with it. This is what we continue reiterating, and I want to stress that we continue fighting for everyone injured, not only in Olenivka, because those are the people who fulfilled their duty. They were defending Mariupol for more than 3 months, and they gave up. They walked out to be imprisoned in terrible conditions. They would be tortured, we know it 100%. So yes, we're fighting for the international investigation mission and to have all of the wounded servicemen brought back home. Thank you very much. Thank you, Miss Arina. Thank you, Miss Anna. Thank you for your strength. Well, you've probably seen on the social networks, and some mass media supported the initiative of our families, the petition to establish a day of the victims of the terroristic act. The state has not done it within 1 year. We were shocked, and we didn't care whether there is a specific commemoration day or not, but now we want to have a day to commemorate those heroic people. Unfortunately, they did not make it back home, but now sitting here talking, this is something that we can do thanks to their heroic defense of Mariupol. When they were not giving up their arms, they were ready to give up their lives for the safety and security of the people they don't know. So I would like to ask you, to invite you to share this petition so that our government pays attention to this date, the date 29th of June, as a commemoration date of those who were killed in Olenivka. Mr. Andriy, yes, I would like to add a couple of words. We mentioned international crime, the terrorism. I want to draw your attention to the fact that the notion of terrorism is not stronger than the international crime. And moreover, if we talk about the international crimes, there is the system of international justice, criminal justice, well, the International Criminal Court, and in case of terrorism, it's way more complicated. And during the armed conflict, there may be terroristic act, and the presence of terroristic act during the armed conflict cannot be excluded. It's just a small remark. I'm telling international armed conflict because war legally should be declared. If the war is not declared, the international community uses the term international armed conflict, so international humanitarian law can be applied here. And the prisoners of war, they shouldn't be detained as those accused of crime. They are taken their right to freedom, to restrict their right to take part in the battle operations, so they should not be kept in the same conditions as those accused of criminal crimes, and they are not supposed to stay in the conditions that Maria was talking about. And on top of those terrible conditions, which are equal to torturing, this event have occurred that has taken lives of multiple people, and this case is not being investigated. And getting back to the international mission, I want to say that it's only Russian Federation who cannot ensure access, which means they create obstacles in investigation of this crime. And this is the confirmation of the fact that the war crime is committed that is supposed to be investigated. Thank you very much. So the question is, what's on? how this investigation can help in investigation of other crimes and bring into liability of those guilty. Do you cooperate with the Office of Prosecutor General? Do you have anything to make your investigation evolve? Well, we hope that our research will be of use to our law enforcement agencies, and our another goal is to draw everyone's attention to the fact that we should gradually, step by step, achieve the truth. We should start with recreation of events, and then we achieve the point when we talk about the names of those guilty. I know that our law enforcement agencies are in process of investigation. Some names are already identified, and I know there will be notes of suspicion served to those people, and the investigation will continue on the national level. I also want to say that today, due to the lack of time, we won't be talking about the versions, what exactly was incoming to those spots demonstrated by Maria on our website on the website of Media Initiative for Human Rights. We were trying to analyze all the information we've collected. There is our investigation posted there, so we are ready to answer questions if there are any. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. Do we have any questions on the floor? Good afternoon, Ukrinform. I'm having a question regarding the International Investigation Mission. So the mission was terminated. In your opinion, could another international organization create an equal mission which could be efficient, and if so, which organization that could be? So when we talk about the jurisdiction of another country, you can come there either with force or voluntarily. Voluntarily means upon the consent. Russian Federation does not provide any consent, which means that no international organization will have access to that site. Shouldn't Russia provide consent? There is such an organization. It's International Criminal Court, but again, they can investigate about 10, for example, 10 cases per year, but is the jurisdiction of that international organization. Thank you very much. Do we have any more questions? Good afternoon, Tetiana Kazak, Grati editorial. Thank you very much for this investigation. I'm having a question. Did you gather any information about the reasons of that strike? Because during the first days, right after it occurred, the investigation said the strike was inflicted to conceal some tortures that were occurring in those barracks. Well, to conceal the traces of tortures, I don't think that that was the real reason, because the people ended up in those barracks. Even on that board that we were demonstrated, the Azov servicemen, they mentioned that they had only one person injured in those barracks who could not walk out for formation. So Russian parties stated that those servicemen, they started providing evidences against Ukrainian party, how it was all organized, which was also untrue, because none of them obviously provided any such evidences that Russia was meaning when commenting this incident. Well, it's obvious that this crime was planned because the representatives of Azov regiment from different units ended up in those barracks, starting from medics to the representatives of the logistic units. And we might also say that the lists or the barracks were prepared way before. There are indicators of such preparation, some repairs that were taking place there, where the imprisoned servicemen were engaged, they were told that they should repair it within 7 days, and they made it within 5 days. We were also talking to one of the servicemen who was taking part in the repair works before, and it's also apparent that there were lists put together that were read in those barracks of the servicemen who were about to be transferred to those barracks, and we were thinking why they could be transferred to those barracks. Well, and the first thing that comes up to my mind is that it can be initiation of some court process over the servicemen of Azov regiment. They were going to announce Azov regiment a terroristic organization in Russian Federation, but as we see after this event, those proceedings were never initiated. We were also thinking that those servicemen were planned to be exchanged within the exchange process, but it had not happened after the explosions. Not all of them were exchanged, only some minor fraction of those wounded, about 10 of them, and the huge number of the servicemen who were in those barracks, they are still imprisoned and their whereabouts are unknown. There are also a couple of versions why it could have happened that are based on the opinions of Russians that can be debunked by us too. In fact, the concept is not yet known why those specific servicemen, like the representatives of the regiment, they say that it was a random choice, but I still think there was some logic behind that, why the list was like that, why that specific barracks. Well, people could have been gathered in two barracks, into buildings where they were staying. For example, conditionally, if they were planned to be shelled, but at that time other servicemen could have been affected, or the guard. We remember that the Russians were saying that some of their guards were affected, were injured or something like that, but eventually none of the guards of Olenivka detention site were affected. So those barracks should be put on a distance from other facilities so others don't get affected. So the practice of such a mass transfer of the servicemen to one detention site for exchange, there is no such practice. They are being picked from different detention sites and then exchanged. So all those versions, they are at least illogical. Most likely there was a concept to commit certain actions against Azov regiment servicemen, but who organized it is still a question. Whether it was organized on a local level, since some of the servicemen who were in those barracks, they were saying, just like experts that we were communicating with, that there was a dirty job. They didn't make what they were thinking, or whether it was overseen by the FSB or GRU. The representatives of those organizations were present in Olenivka detention site. They were coming there on a regular basis. They were seen by both military and civilian prisoners of war, and there is a lot of questions. Actually, we were trying to formulate them to start looking for answers. I have something to add. For example, the killing of the prisoners of war was being prepared starting from June in the information space. For example, on the 5th of June, it was stated in propaganda channels that Ukraine is getting HIMARS, and the three versions that were
proposed was the shelling of Olenivka detention site to kill the prisoners of war. Then, by the end of June, they were recording a video with Vladislav Duchak where he asks Ukrainian party not to shell the colony. And then they make a video with Dmitro Kozatsky, who calls sign Orest, who is providing evidences against Arestovich, and on that night 28-29 there is an explosion. So Russia was preparing this act of terrorism. I just don't know why the relevant authorities in our country didn't pay attention to this. If we would have brought it to the media, it could have influenced the process. I don't know why, but those are the facts. I want to add, we may qualify this event as an act of terrorism inside of the war crime. Maybe we will not be able to find out all the details of those events. Russia had enough time to clear the evidences. Moreover, we have evidences that they were scattering around the debris. The site was not investigated right upon the event. As we liberate more of our guys, we may find more and more information, but to say that there was a war crime, we may state about some basic postulates. The prisoners of war should be kept in a safe facility. They should be treated in a way to exclude any improper behavior or attitude, to exclude the case of their death, and all those aspects were violated. They were not located in the safe place. By the way, Olenivka is not functioning now, for what we know. Then we may state that they were treated improperly, and that attitude was inhumane. It was equal to torture and failure to conduct investigation. How can you treat the situation when the state violates all three aspects and they ignore the international investigation? We may state that they are interested in concealing this situation, and we may not even clarify whether it happened as a result of their neglect, but we may just state that they failed to fulfill their obligations, which constitutes a war crime. Thank you. More questions if you need a phone.
Мене звати Christopher. Are you documenting the disinformation that Russia used at the time? For instance, they had already preceded the idea that HIMARS were a part of this. So in part of your report, are you showing the way in which that they were using Telegram and others to confuse the investigation at the time? Дякую.
Regarding the document, and we were documenting it from the very beginning as the tragedy only happened. The only source of information was Russian Federation. All the photos, all the videos were only emergent from Russian side. It was the only way to collect any evidences whatsoever. Even the list that they were publishing, that was the only source of information. We could only check them to what extent they were true. We were checking whether the people were really imprisoned. We could get in touch with their families. We could check whether those people were really located in Olenivka. We were looking for satellite images of the detention site to see whether there was really an explosion there. So unfortunately, since none of the parties had access to the site, Russian Federation was the only source of information, and right upon the explosions in the morning, they published their official version of the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation that Ukraine had used HIMARS. So that was the only information, but our experts, based on the video published by Russians, And by the way the barracks were looking, the explosion site were looking, and the condition of the bodies produced a version that most likely it was a thermobaric weapon, because everything was burnt very heavily and very quickly. And even now that the bodies were returned, when the guys were liberated and exchanged, and after the investigation of the debris that is taken, of the shrapnel that is taken out of their bodies, we still cannot come to final conclusions. We need the access to the site, but now that it's been a year since the event, and based upon the evidences of those who made it out of the colony when the site was cleared, we understand that Russian Federation had time to clear everything excessive and to leave only things that they need to remain on the site. And we may confirm it by the bodies that are being returned to Ukraine, the bodies of the killed prisoners of war. There was such practice even before the 24th of February, when Russia returned the bodies to Ukraine. They worked with those bodies quite thoroughly. All of the things that can serve as the evidences are taken out of those bodies by Russian experts. For example, before the 24th of February, there was a case when one of the prisoners of war, one of his bodies was returned and his intestines were taken out. Well, when we say HIMARS, it's something that sounds beautiful. It references our partners who provide weapons, like look how Ukrainians are using those weapons, but we shouldn't we shouldn't rely on such media cases, but rather we should rely on the facts. When we talk about HIMARS, it's a long-range weapon that was provided to inflict damage on the targets which are located on the distance. Well, Olenivka is 15 kilometers from the front lines, so how safe is it to bring HIMARS into the area of where the Russian electronic warfare means are effective? It's just not practical. So all the debris should be photographed. They should be documented where those debris were right upon the explosions. For example, there were evidences of debris being scattered around from the bag. So we may say that previously, when there were no HIMARS, Russia were saying HIMARS, HIMARS, and again HIMARS. Now they keep reiterating the same thing with the storms. And in their videos, you may see that someone is holding that piece of missile in their hands, even not where they were scattered. Oh, good afternoon. My name is Oleg Veremienko. I have a question, but again, based on what I've heard, I want to pay your attention to a couple of things. First, I was visiting the gas cameras of Auschwitz that were created by Nazis during the Reich times, and the story that I've heard, the details that you're telling about, they remind me of those gas cameras of Auschwitz. I've seen it with my own eyes, and I was able to touch the walls there. And what I want to draw your attention to, what I was impressed from what I've heard from you, from the families of those killed, that people were gathered there for purpose, for reason. Well, it's clear even for the unprepared listener. And they were gathered there based upon the principle that they were all Azov servicemen. They were put in one building. So it's the same story that with the gas camera, with the only difference that they were not killed by gas, but rather by some explosive device from inside. And another thing, I was a defender of Zaporizhia arsonists. There was a similar case when there was a terroristic act in the church. There was an explosion in the church, and I've seen the pictures from Olenivka, from the open sources in the mass media. And what I've seen in Zaporizhia after that terroristic act. I think that it was committed by the FSB, by the way, and my personal opinion, based on the pictures that I've seen from Olenivka, that it was an explosion planned from the inside. It was not a projectile incoming, it was no HIMARS. I was taking part in the criminal cases with the pyrotechnics, so that's my experience. And I have a question, hence, for the time being, first question, are there any investigations initiated, the criminal cases initiated on the level of the prosecutor's office or other law enforcement agencies? Is anybody recognized as the victims, and did the government of Ukraine address any international organizations upon the fact of international crime? Thank you. Oleg, thank you very much for your comment and your questions. I would like to put it in brief. The Office of Prosecutor General initiated the investigation on the very first date. Right upon the first news, they start investigating it based on the Article 438, and it's also investigated by the Security Service of Ukraine. And yes, thank you for your question. Yes, there are criminal cases initiated by the Security Service of Ukraine and the Office of Prosecutor General, and I can say personally that within 8 months I was not recognized as the victim in this process. I never knew it. I only got this information when I asked the lawyer, and only through my lawyer, upon submission of a number of reports, I was recognized as a victim in these proceedings. Well, look, getting back to the moment of the 5th of January, when we started looking for the families, every family was coming to the police, some during the terroristic act or before or after that, and they submitted their reports that their relatives are imprisoned, and in every specific case there was a criminal proceedings initiated. So there was a terroristic act then, and it's a question whether it should be a joint case. Well, in that after the terroristic act, there was an arranged process on the government level. There was an investigator, Stetsek Roman, from Security Service of Ukraine, and in case of and he investigated the case of those killed by what was about those injured. And I was told that for every case of the injured person, they have their officer responsible for investigation in each case. So every family, we started asking for support from the lawyers, and we asked to create a joint investigation with the Prosecutor General's office, and they told us it's impossible because there are those killed and there are those wounded, and those should be two parallel cases. So how this case is moving, I don't still know. We are still being responded that about the injured, you have your responsible officer, and in Security Service of Ukraine we have Roman Stetsik as the investigator, and we have more persons with whom we communicate from Office of Prosecutor General. So the case was initiated upon the Article 438, but for somebody the case was initiated as for the people missing in action, and I think that now this article will be requalified. For my husband it was Article 438 because I submitted my report to the police only this year. I didn't deem it necessary before that. Thank you very much. Now that we seem not to have any more questions on the floor, I want to thank everybody for the great job you have done. We believe that all of the perpetrators will be brought to liability and the justice will prevail. Ukraine Media Center, Ukrinform will continue its operation tomorrow. Glory to Ukraine.